Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first session of the Talks in Chinese Humanities seminar series for 2024. Before we start today, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Gadigal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people joining us today. I'm very pleased to welcome our first speaker in the series for this year, Pete Millwood. Just an introduction to the series. The Talks in Chinese Humanities series is co-presented by the China Studies Centre and the discipline of Chinese Studies at the University of Sydney, as well as the Australian Society for Asian Humanities and the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at UNSW. My name is Minerva Inwald. I'm Judith Nielsen Postdoctoral Fellow in Contemporary Art at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And today we have a speaker joining us from the University of Melbourne. Pete Millwood is a lecturer in East Asian history. He studied for his DPhil in history at Oxford, during which time he held fellowships at Peking University and the Library of Congress. Prior to his appointment at the University of Melbourne, he held postdoctoral fellowships at Tsinghua and Oxford Universities, the London School of Economics, and in the Society of Fellows in Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. Dr. Millwood's research has been published in Diplomatic History and the Journal of Contemporary History, and his research has been featured in the Washington Post, History Today, the South China Morning Post, and on BBC Radio 4. His first book, Improbable Diplomats, which we'll be hearing about today, was published by Cambridge University Press in December 2022. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Millwood, and I'll hand over to you now for the talk. Thank you. Oh, just to let the audience know, we'll have the talk. You can then, there'll be time for questions at the end. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat box. You can do that during the talk or at the end once questions begin. So yes, please feel free to put any questions for Dr. Millwood in the chat. All right, great. I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Minerva, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for attending. So, as you know, the book's title, as has just been said, is Improbable Diplomats, How Ping-Pong Players, Musicians, and Scientists Remade US-China Relations. I hope you can all see the PowerPoint and hear me okay. Minerva, maybe stop me if that's not the case. So the subject matter of the book is the rich history of contact between Chinese and US societies that took place in the 1970s. The book looks beyond and below the famous summit meetings held between Chinese and US leaders in that decade that include, of course, the famous 1972 Nixon-Mao meeting and Deng Xiaoping's 1979 visit to the United States that marked the formal establishment or normalization of diplomatic relations between the People's Republic of China and the United States. My book offers a new account of the Sino-American rapprochement that centers the active program of cultural, sporting, and scientific exchanges that reconnected Chinese and American societies after more than 2 decades of near total isolation following the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So early in my narrative, I look at the famous Ping-Pong diplomacy of 1971 that predated any visit to the PRC by US officials, while the book concludes with the establishment of official diplomatic relations in 1978, but it shows that, as in Ping-Pong diplomacy, it was the societal, transnational relationship that was deepened before the diplomatic relationship was officially normalized in 1979. In part, then, the book is an attempt to offer an alternative narrative. Improbable Diplomats recognizes and restores the historical agency of Chinese and American people beyond the leaders and officials of their countries. And it considers a vibrant, complex history of transnational exchange of science and culture. The core argument of the book, however, is that cultural and scientific exchanges and transnational contacts more broadly did more than just reacquaint the Chinese and American people. The book shows that people-to-people contacts exerted a powerful influence on the US-China diplomatic relationship and indeed on the negotiations that took place in summit meetings. The book also contributes to our understanding of the origins of modern China. It traces how exchange visits help create and recreate transnational communities that help facilitate China's opening to the United States and the world through the 1970s and beyond, an opening that has had profound effects on China's economy and society. In doing so, the book attempts to connect with and make an intervention in the established historiography of Sino-American relations in Chinese international history. Existing works by international historians have given us a highly detailed account of the relationship between the Chinese and American governments during this period. The negotiations conducted between Nixon and Mao and their deputies, Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, were at the time highly secretive. As the records of their conversations gradually became available, historians pored over their contents in order to analyze the secret agreements that were made during Sino-American summit diplomacy. The journalists, political scientists, and historians that do so include a distinguished list of people: Harry Harding, Robert Ross, Chen Zhen, Margaret Macmillan, Xia Yafeng, Yang Song, Patrick Tyler, James Mann, Rosemary Foote, and Evelyn Goh. I'm primarily seeking to build on these studies by expanding the range of actors included in our narratives of Sino-American relations in the 1970s. The people-to-people transnational contacts that my book examines are largely passed over in works that focus on high diplomacy, written primarily using state archives. Although in ways, I'm also questioning some of the conclusions of previous historians. For example, I take issue with one of the key assumptions of many of these works that has been central to the prevailing orthodox explanations for Sino-American rapprochement, namely that geopolitical factors, particularly the triangular diplomacy of shared opposition to the Soviet Union, can alone explain the changing quality of the Sino-American relationship throughout this decade. In fact, my research shows that while strategic calculations were important structurally and in the early stages of rapprochement, from 1973, there was almost no tangible progress in security collaboration between the two governments before 1979. Sino-American strategic alignment remained because of the shared competition with the Soviet Union, but it was not itself an impetus for a fully normalized relationship. Instead, it was the people-to-people relationship that saw significant change over the mid to late 1970s, which in turn influenced the diplomatic relationship in ways I'll describe in more detail in a few moments. So my book also contributes to a less established but rapidly growing area of scholarship that considers China's transnational relationship with the United States and the outside world in the post-1949 era. And I'm going to speak about a few of the books that came out before mine, but it's also notable that there are even more books coming out in the near future in this area that contribute to this transnational approach to China's foreign relations and to Sino-American relations. So those that were written at a date before my own book include Robertson Taj-Frazier and Fabio Lanza's studies of radical leftist Americans who were the focus of China's limited transnational contacts with the United States in the 1960s and early 1970s. These visits that Lanza and Frazier examine were part of the Chinese courting of both Black and white Americans who had strong left-wing political views, a subject also studied by Paul Hollander, David Court, Anne-Marie Brady, and Julia Lovell. My former Hong Kong University colleague, Xu Guoqi, has also made an important contribution to this field with his examination of the transnational Sino-American relationship over the longue durée, while Meredith Oyen has looked at the role of transnational migration in the US-China relationship from 1945 through to the 1970s. Finally, my former Oxford colleagues, Christian Talley and Gillian Gowit, have focused on the role of trade and economics in China's relationship with the outside world in the 1970s and 1980s. So while there is then clearly growing interest in Sino-American history beyond high-level diplomacy, these existing works have either focused on periods other than the 1970s or looked at just one set of transnational actors in that decade, such as Talley's focus on trade or Lanza's examination of the politically radical Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars. My book draws on these existing works and their methodological innovations in seeking to show the connection between a broad range of transnational contacts and the diplomatic relationship in the first decade of sustained Sino-American contact after 1949. And I build on Talley, Fraser, and Lanza's research on the 1970s using English language sources by myself drawing on Chinese language primary sources, as I'll discuss in a few moments. So one of the ways I hope this book makes a contribution to the fields of international and transnational history is through its methodology. That methodology seeks to draw on the innovations of transnational history and on fresh archival evidence to engage with the diplomatic history works I mentioned a few moments ago. Indeed, my project starting point was, in fact, a diplomatic history one. I first came across significant archival evidence about Sino-American people-to-people exchanges in US government archives when I was working on a previous project on American and Chinese elite perceptions and misperceptions of the other's domestic politics. These government documents made clear to me that the Sino-American exchange program was by no means wholly controlled by officials. Henry Kissinger had wanted them to be. Soon after the two governments resumed contact in 1971, he proposed that the burgeoning program of private people-to-people exchanges be brought in-house and managed directly by the two governments. But the Chinese government refused this suggestion, and they insisted that as long as the US government resisted making the diplomatic governmental relationship wholly official by recognizing the PRC as the sole government representing China, then the exchange program must in turn be managed on a similarly unofficial people-to-people basis. There was, of course, hypocrisy in Beijing's stance. In the Communist Society of 1970s China, there were no truly private organizations. Beijing did not run the exchange program directly out of the foreign ministry, but the organizations they chose to oversee these contacts were ultimately nonetheless controlled by the state. Groups such as the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs and the Scientific and Technical Association of the PRC were not always staffed by serving officials, but they answered ultimately to central government. This was not true, however, on the American side of exchange diplomacy. After Kissinger's suggestion of government-managed exchanges was rebuffed, the US government concluded that there could be advantages to having the exchange program run by private groups, and that the government's interest in exchanges could be protected, even if such groups were independent. Having made this conclusion, the government sought candidates with which to cooperate, and they identified two particular organizations. Both organizations had already had some contact with Chinese counterparts, and under the sponsorship of first the US government and then the Chinese government, the two groups would soon become central to the exchange program. The first of these was the National Committee on US-China Relations, an organization that continues to operate today and is known by the acronym NCUSCR, or simply as the National Committee. The second was the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China, or CSC-PRC. This group, unlike the National Committee, is now defunct, but was then housed within the US National Academy of Sciences. I've been one of the first researchers to have had access to the records of these two groups, and my book offers the first detailed account of their part in diplomacy with China in this period. Making use of both government documents and sources from non-governmental organizations reveals how both the Chinese and US governments recognize the importance of exchanges and exchange organizations, and in response made a concerted effort to control and co-opt these private actors. In turn, these efforts prompted both cooperation and resistance from the National Committee and the CSC-PRC. Both organizations recognized that collaboration with government could enhance their influence and provide much needed funding for their programs. At the same time, both groups were ambivalent about efforts by the two governments to dictate the direction of their programming and wished to preserve their organizational independence. This dynamic then was not a simple one of government control versus non-governmental resistance, but instead something more complex. In this way, then, my case study suggests that exchange diplomacy and high-level summit diplomacy can be mutually constitutive, with neither wholly determining or disconnected from the other. As I've already mentioned, my methodology combined evidence from both the US and Chinese sides of the relationship. Like other scholars working on the PRC's foreign relations, at least in the last, decade, certainly the last 7 years or so, had to navigate the limited sources available from the Chinese Foreign Ministry archive. That archive was closed during the first few years of my research when I had that fellowship Minerva mentioned at Beida. And although I was able to use the archive in 2017 after its partial reopening, I found that most documents relevant to a study of the 1970s and relations with the United States in that period have now been sadly reclassified. One of the ways I circumvented this challenge was by making a comprehensive use of the central Chinese government documents from this period that have been published in official collections, such as the Mao Zedong Nianpu, which was released in 2013. These sources reveal, among other things, the close involvement of the PRC leadership in China's exchange contacts. For example, the Mao Nianpu, as well as similar collections of Zhou Enlai's documents, show how the very top Chinese leaders were intricately involved in the planning and execution of ping-pong diplomacy. Remembered as a spontaneous moment of people-to-people friendship for interactions like the one depicted here, the episode was, we now know, carefully engineered by leaders in Beijing, including Mao himself. I also gathered Chinese archival evidence from local municipal and provincial archives in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, and Tianjin. These sources offer important insights into the experience of Sino-American cultural and scientific exchange on the ground in China. For example, they reveal how the Chinese state worked to control the image of the PRC formed by American visitors. One indicative set of documents was written by the cadres that accompanied a 1974 visit of American architects that included the Chinese-American I.M. Pei, who would later design the Louvre Pyramid and Hong Kong's Bank of China Tower. These archival sources detail how the cadres went as far as conducting a struggle session with their American guests to dissuade them from a habit of taking pictures of what the Chinese hosts labeled Chinese backwardness. That is, idyllic pictures of rural peasants at work or of traditional sail-powered junks. The cadres pushed their American guests to instead focus on photographing the PRC's industrial achievements. But this is what Beijing wanted Americans to associate with China in the 1970s. Other Chinese archival documents reveal how the PRC made use of exchanges to upgrade the country's science and technology sector. While documents from the early 1970s are awash with statements about receiving Americans to showcase Cultural Revolution era revolutionary applied science, documents from the period after Mao's 1976 death reveal that Chinese factories were using scientific exchanges to learn about the most up-to-date American industrial technology. For example, a 1978 delegation of American metallurgists gave seminars in China on how they had used computer automation to upgrade US steel manufacturing, with the Chinese documents including extensive practical notes on how the PRC might learn from this example. I also analysed first-hand experiences of travel to China by Americans and to America by Chinese by using the personal papers of some of the first American visitors to China, to the PRC, and by consulting the extensive Chinese memoir literature from this period, as well as by conducting more than 20 oral history interviews with individuals like Susan Shirk, who traveled to China in 1971 on the first delegation of American graduate students to the PRC, and who was present already in Beijing when Henry Kissinger arrived on his first secret visit that year. So considered together, this range of official, non-governmental and personal sources has allowed me to construct for the first time a full and multi-layered account of the Sino-American exchange program of the 1970s. These sources reveal how transnational exchange contacts were at the center of both the symbolism and the substance of the relationship between China and the United States in the 1970s. I think that perhaps the best way to give you a sense of how Sino-American people-to-people diplomacy played out in this period is to offer a short account of three important moments in my book's narrative, rather than going through the book chapter by chapter, as of course some do during book talks. However, if anyone would like me to expand on what is covered in any of the specific chapters, I'd be glad to do so during the Q&A. In particular, I think each of these three moments reveals and elucidates two dynamics at the core of my book's narrative. First, the connection between transnational people-to-people contacts on the one hand and the high-level diplomatic relationship on the other. And second, the relationship between the non-state actors that are the book's primary protagonists and official state actors. So the first moment I'll talk about is the 1972 return leg of Ping-Pong diplomacy. This trip was the result of an invitation made by the American table tennis team at the conclusion of their famous April 1971 visit to China. However, the US ping-pong team was truly an amateur outfit. All the players had day jobs, they practiced in their basements, and they had to pay their own travel to Nagoya, where they had first met their Chinese counterparts at the World Championships there. The US Table Tennis Association only had perhaps a little bit more money than its players and simply couldn't have hosted a return leg on its own. For this reason, the Table Tennis Association reached out to a more established organization, the National Committee on US-China Relations, to host the Chinese team in the United States a year after the first leg of this historic matchup. Their trip was the first ever official delegation of PRC citizens to the United States. Not the first time that any PRC citizen had been to the United States, but the first official delegation from Communist China. And it was another media spectacle after the Nixon summit of 2 months prior. US government documents make clear that officials, up to and including the president, believed that the visit was a decisive make or break moment in the developing rapprochement. While Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai also attached great importance to the tour, personally selecting and briefing the Chinese players involved in the trip. Neither government was certain that the Chinese team would be welcomed by ordinary Americans, who had, after all, been encouraged to see the PRC as a dangerous, irrational foe as recently as the 1960s. Indeed, in Beijing, the foreign ministry fretted that they were sending their highly decorated table tennis team into hostile and dangerous territory from which they might not return. Mao believed there was a danger too, and he told the team as such, but he added that this was a risk worth taking, given that a successful visit would publicly symbolize improved Sino-American relations and China's elevated international status. Nixon and Kissinger also concerned themselves with symbolism, with the symbolism of the trip, believing that the reception of the ping-pong players would be read as a sign of the progress of their overall China initiative. Internally, the White House concluded that the visit must proceed, quote, flawlessly, and that, quote, any untoward incident could have major international repercussions. The government believed the visit would even have an impact on international politics beyond the Sino-American relationship. The trip was timetabled to end at least a month before Nixon's visit to Moscow, for fear that the Soviets would be so put out by the Ping-Pong tour that it would hurt the chances for agreement during the Brezhnev summit scheduled for that year. So to ensure that the return leg was a success, Nixon appointed one of his senior aides, former journalist John Scarley, as his personal representative to oversee the planning and execution of the tour. Scarley had been a noted ABC journalist who, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, secretly acted as a White House go-between with a Russian KGB colonel. Nixon had made him a presidential foreign policy advisor in 1971. And one of Scarley's contributions to the visit was arranging for a CIA security detail for the group, which was paid for with federal government funds. The two government security concerns were not wholly unjustified. In the event, while the tour was largely welcomed by the American public, there were also frequent protests, some of which turned violent. But Scarley and the US government also used this genuine hazard to exert control over the programming of the visit. For example, sanitizing a visit to Detroit by replacing a trip to a health clinic that treated heroin users with a more palatable afternoon at an inner-city school, even in the face of protest at the change from what Scarley described as the liberal wing of the National Committee. The tour was a performance by both visitors and hosts. For the Chinese players, the visit was a chance to change perceptions of the PRC and to portray their country's citizens in a very different light to how they had been seen during the 2 decades of confrontation with the United States. As friendly and dignified guests, as accomplished but humble athletes, and as proud but not zealously ideological citizens of a new China. The National Committee on US-China Relations conceived of the visit as a showcase of the United States. The National Committee did so in a manner that was idealized, but it was also consciously representative. A particular theme of the National Committee's programming for the tour was, quote, diversity. Thus, the ping-pong players crisscrossed the United States, visiting, among other places, Ann Arbor, New York, Memphis, Alabama, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And alongside their table tennis matches, they were given a sightseeing itinerary that included visits to a Detroit car plant, to Colonial Williamsburg, a majority Black church in Memphis, and a final R&R trip to Disneyland. Ultimately, the tour was, I think, a remarkable success. The Chinese players and their government were bowled over by the warmth from record American audiences for table tennis and large crowds of well-wishers, not least many Chinese Americans who came out to show their pride in the team. The rapturous public reception of the tour was, I think, a key moment in confirming to both governments the American public enthusiasm for rebuilding a relationship between the two societies that was far broader than secretive elite summit diplomacy. The visit's success also deepened the mutual trust between the non-governmental National Committee and the two governments. Beijing was impressed by the National Committee's competence, and Scarley too found the organization easy to work with. Simultaneously, the National Committee appreciated US government assistance, even if they did worry that government involvement in exchanges might come to impact on their independence. Thus, the second ping-pong tour's dynamic of a privately run exchange, organized in cooperation with the two governments, would soon be repeated in other major cultural exchanges, such as the visit of China's Shenyang acrobatic troupe later the same year, and the visit of the Philadelphia Orchestra to China in 1973. So the second moment in Sino-American people-to-people diplomacy I want to mention was, in contrast to the ping-pong tour, one of conflict. The dispute occurred in March 1975 over another National Committee cultural exchange, a planned US tour by a famous Chinese performing arts troupe. The troupe was set to be the largest group of visitors to travel in either direction since that Philadelphia Orchestra's China tour. It was also scheduled for a sensitive moment in Sino-American relations. During President Gerald Ford's first year in office, cultural exchanges have been one of the few positive aspects of the Sino-American relationship at a time when high-level negotiations were deadlocked because of Ford's concerns about criticism from the Republican right if he was to make any compromise on the issue of Taiwan in diplomatic negotiations with Beijing. But the success of the performing arts visit was cast into doubt when, just days before the group was set to arrive in the US, the Chinese side added a song to the troupe's program that boasted of their plans to reunify China at the expense of Chiang Kai-shek's regime on Taiwan. The song was entitled Compatriots of Taiwan, Our Flesh and Blood, and included the provocative lyrics, "We are determined to liberate Taiwan, unite our motherland. The flood of revolution cannot be impeded." In adding this song to the program, the PRC was unashamedly politicizing a cultural exchange that was ostensibly intended to build friendship. This would, of course, hardly go unnoticed by the US media during a high-profile public visit. Thus, first the National Committee and then the US government pushed back against the song's inclusion, and President Ford was even personally involved in proposing a compromise solution to Chinese diplomats that would have allowed the visit to go ahead and stopped the disagreement from becoming public. But the diplomats did not agree to the deal, and the trip was thus cancelled by the US side at the very last minute. The cancellation was probably the most public moment of conflict in Sino-American relations, transnational or diplomatic, since contact had been resumed in 1971. Thousands of people had already bought tickets for performances, and the cancellation of the tour, and the reason for that cancellation, attracted significant media attention. The incident alerted the public to the downturn in the relationship between the Chinese and US governments, something that had previously been denied publicly, at least in Washington. Meanwhile, American leftist supporters of the PRC and its stance on Taiwan fed the flames of the dispute by organizing public protests that explicitly blamed the US government and its Taiwan policy for the cancellation. Indeed, the Chinese government had consciously sought the confrontation as a public protest against Ford's failure to end the official US relationship with Taiwan, a condition for normalization with the PRC. Thus, at a time when government-level talks were deadlocked, cultural exchanges had become another arena for negotiation and politicking. So the final moment I'd like to introduce to you today was the visit by President Jimmy Carter's top science advisor, Frank Press, to China in July 1978. The visit occurred just 6 months before the agreement to re-establish and normalize Sino-American relations, and was deeply connected to that agreement. The visit was at the time the highest ranking American scientific delegation ever sent to any other country, and it came at a critical juncture in the development of Sino-American scientific cooperation. Press went to China after more than 50 delegations of scientists and scholars had traveled between the two countries, all organized on a non-governmental basis. There have been limits to the lengths of these trips, however. Typically, they lasted a little while, a month or 6 weeks, but this limit had necessarily limited the depth of the academic cooperation possible through these exchanges. Press's trip also occurred at a moment in which Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping was fundamentally rethinking China's science policy, including the country's approach to scientific exchanges with the United States. Press's trip thus precipitated a significant upgrading of scientific cooperation between China and the United States, opening the door to scholars and students spending years in each country and to direct government-to-government scientific cooperation. The press delegation was more overtly official than either of the previous two moments I've spoken about. Press was a seismologist, but in 1978 he worked in the White House. His landmark trip was, however, deeply connected to earlier and ongoing transnational scientific exchanges. Many of the proposals for deeper cooperation made by Press had already been suggested to both governments by American scientists in the years before his visit by the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the PRC and its parent organization, the US National Academy of Sciences. The same committee was also immediately tasked with implementing the US side of many of the scientific agreements made during the Press visit. Frank Press himself was personally familiar with these proposals because he had chaired the non-governmental CSC-PRC between 1975 and 1977. Moreover, Press had taken the long-time CSC-PRC staff director, Anne Keatley, into the White House, following her work as the primary administrator at the CSC-PRC since its earliest involvement in exchanges in 1972. Keatley continued to be Press's chief aide in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the two headed up the US government strategy for the 1978 visit to China. Press's visit then grew out of the CSC-PRC's work, building scientific cooperation with the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Scientific and Technical Association of the PRC in the years before 1978. Press's trip proved to be a major step towards normalization. During his visit, the American seismologist made clear to his host that both the US government and American scientists were keen to assist in Deng's drive towards modernization. That is, if Beijing would agree to Washington's terms for normalization. I argue in the book that the prospect of this scientific assistance helped convince Deng to agree to a US proposed compromise on the issue of Taiwan, thus unlocking the normalization agreement made at the end of 1978. And in addition, meaning that the United States continued to sell arms to Taiwan after that date, and indeed up to today, so with very profound long-term consequences. So in conclusion, my book argues that in all these moments and more, diplomacy through cultural and scientific exchanges played a critical role in the Sino-American rapprochement. Ping-pong players from both countries found themselves taking on a role typically performed by diplomats, and they were followed by many more Chinese and Americans outside of government, musicians and scientists, acrobats, and journalists. The visits of these transnational actors come diplomats were often major events in a Sino-American relationship that remained unofficial until 1979. When exchanges were successful, they precipitated breakthroughs in diplomatic talks. And when there was conflict over exchanges, this was also powerfully felt in the overall relationship. Meanwhile, considered as a whole, exchange visits cumulatively rebuilt trust and understanding between the two countries and reactivated transnational epistemic communities, even if exchanges sometimes also bred frustration and fueled stereotypes and misunderstandings. Thus, my book shows that a full understanding of the Sino-American relationship in this period has to go beyond summit diplomacy. Only with a more holistic understanding of the Sino-American relationship of the 1970s can we understand the profound role that transnational connections have played, not only in Sino-American relations, but also the post-Mao development of China. So I'll end my presentation there, but I look forward to reading your questions in the chat and then to answering a few of them and discussing. Thank you very much for your attention.